Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The left got violent over the weekend while the press averted its gaze and pretended nothing at all happened.
If it came down to it and it was a group effort, we'd have to do him like Gaddafi.
Murder him? Murder him for the people? What's that?
I'd on his leg.
If I get a chance to him up, I would.
Chance to him up? You would? Yeah.
We'll have a detailed report on the violence in D.C. and Charlottesville yesterday, telling you what actually happened through the filter. But first, disgraced FBI agent Peter Strzok is now ex-FBI agent Peter Strzok. Strzok, who you'll remember worked on Robert Mueller's team and helped spearhead the initial investigation into Russian election meddling, was fired in part over the countless political text messages he sent to his girlfriend Lisa Page. After being fired, Strzok responded by starting a Twitter account following Rosie O'Donnell and posting a single tweet which begged for money on GoFundMe. What does Strzok's firing mean for the Mueller investigation, the search for Russian collusion? Should it shake our faith in its foundations? Alan Dershowitz has been following this from the very beginning. He's a retired Harvard law professor, of course, and author of The Case Against Impeaching Trump. He joins us tonight. Professor, what's the lesson of the firing of Peter Strzok for the rest of us?
Well, personally, I'm sympathetic to Strzok. He was an excellent FBI agent for years in counterintelligence. He made a very, very serious mistake. The mistake was not opposing Trump. He's allowed to do that under the Hatch Act and other statutes. He's allowed to express any views he wants. His big mistake was not recusing himself. When he was tweeting that he's going to make sure that Trump doesn't become president, that he has an insurance policy, it was clear at that point that he could not be perceived as being fair and just. And so by not recusing himself, I think he violated his position of trust. I wouldn't go too far and blame it on the very top authorities of the FBI. They didn't know. And when they did know, they did demote him and take him out of the investigation. So I think it's a blemish, but I don't think it's a fatal flaw in the investigation. I think there are deeper and more fatal flaws. But personal sympathy for Strzok, but ultimately I think it was the right decision.
But don't those texts suggest why he didn't recuse himself? I mean, it's one thing to express a political opinion. I do it for a living. I don't think I agree with you. It's not disqualifying. But he was doing more than that. He was suggesting that his opinions would in some way drive the criminal investigation that he was conducting, and that's a subversion of justice.
Well, that's the issue. He, of course, denied under oath that in any way he was influenced by his hatred for Trump in any of his professional decisions. But when he says to his friend, we're going to stop him, we need an insurance policy, whether there's the reality of interference or the perception of a thumb on the scale, that's enough to recuse yourself. That's why Rod Rosenstein should recuse himself. He is a witness in this case, and the idea that you can be the chief prosecutor and the main witness at the same time is such an obvious conflict of interest that I don't understand how he can continue to go forward running this investigation. So we have at least two major conflicts of interest, and I think it does raise some questions about the integrity of the investigation. But let's wait and see. Mueller himself, I think, is nonpartisan. I don't think he cares whether he helps Republicans or Democrats. He's a zealot, some say overzealous, prosecutor, and he's using tactics that I have disapproved of for 50 years, going after Manafort in order to squeeze him, to get him to sing or to compose. Those are very questionable tactics, but they're used over and over again against people, sometimes innocent people.
Well, they certainly are. You're right. And it's a wake-up for a lot of us who have made excuses for prosecutorial misconduct over the years. And I hope minds are changed about it going forward. But back up just 1 second to what you said about Rod Rosenstein not recusing himself. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Someone conducting an investigation, overseeing it, and being a witness in it. Why wouldn't he recuse himself?
I don't understand it. I just don't get it. I wonder if he's worried that the person who replaces him as being in charge of the investigation, remember that his boss can't do it, Jeff Sessions, recused. But I'll tell you, if one good thing has come out of this thing, one bad thing is that civil libertarians and liberals have stopped being skeptical of prosecutors. Now, every prosecutor, every FBI agent are wonderful, wonderful people. We can't criticize them. But if conservatives now become supportive of at least probing prosecutors and looking over their shoulders, and asking the question, who will guard the guardians? I think it will be a very good thing for America and a very good thing for civil liberties, which is why, although I voted for Hillary Clinton, I am strongly supportive of keeping the civil liberties argument in the forefront as we go forward in this investigation.
Well, sure. Why would you want unchecked power? People with the power to destroy your life, to shoot you, to have no oversight. It's terrifying. Professor, thanks for reminding us of that.
And
I
think it's
appreciate
a good thing that conservatives now appreciate that. Thank you.
Amen. Well, the summer 2016 meeting between a Russian lawyer and Donald Trump Jr. has, of course, become the centerpiece for the Russia collusion conspiracy theory that has completely overwhelmed the workings of government. Increasingly, though, that meeting looks like it may have been a setup designed from the outset to sabotage the Trump campaign. Lee Smith has looked carefully at this. He writes for Real Clear Investigations. He has a brand new piece on it today, which you should read. It's fascinating. And he joins us tonight. Lee, so you took a very close look at this meeting. What did you conclude?
Yeah, thanks, Tucker, for having me on. Look, I think one of the most important things to look at, it's actually, there's one key to it, and that is the Russian lawyer that is supposed to be the test of the proof of collusion. This was a client of Glenn Simpson, and Glenn Simpson was the person who was responsible for producing the Clinton-funded dossier. So how does this happen? How does this combination happen? How are all these people in the same room? I think that's the essential point that's been elided or obscured almost all the time in the press. And I think that once the people look at that fact, things start to become clearer.
And you're speaking of Veselnitskaya, is that correct?
Yes, exactly, Natalia Veselnitskaya.
So explain the famous Russian attorney who says she was in there to talk about Russian adoptions, and then others say she was there to peddle dirt on Hillary Clinton. How was she a client of Glenn Simpson's?
Yeah, the whole idea about her talking about adoptions, that's part of her effort to roll back the Magnitsky Act, which was sanctioning Russian officials and other associates of Vladimir Putin. So, again, Glenn Simpson, who was hired by the Clinton campaign to produce the dossier allegedly unearthing Trump's ties to Russia, is actually working on behalf of pro-Kremlin interests. That's what Natalia Veselnitskaya is doing in that meeting. She's actually pushing a campaign that Glenn Simpson is partnered with to roll back American legislation on Putin regime officials and other associates.
So a Glenn Simpson client is the key to the case that the Trump family was involved in colluding with the Russian government. Glenn Simpson also the person paid to assemble a dossier proving collusion between the Trump family and the Russian government. So why is this not a widely known fact?
I mean, look, I think that basically what's happened here is I think that we've seen Fusion GPS and we've seen the press basically take a picture, right? And the picture is of Donald Trump and other Trump campaign members in a meeting with a Russian lawyer. And then they wrote the caption underneath. And what does the caption say? Collusion. The other caption is the real caption is something else. The facts are different. The facts are that Veselnitskaya is there working on a case that Glenn Simpson is also working on. They're partnered on the same job on behalf of pro-Kremlin interest. So, yes, it's an enormous issue that that has been misreported or underreported since the story first broke a little more than a year ago now, in 2017, reporting the 2016 meeting.
It's just an amazing fact. It's really, a year ago I never would have believed any of this. Lee Smith, thank you for that. It was great reporting.
Thank you, Tucker. Thanks.
Antifa got violent in Washington and Charlottesville yesterday. The press tried to ignore it, but it happened. It's on tape. Mark Stein joins us after the break to discuss exactly what happened. Also, a lot going on over the last week, including news from the creepy porn lawyer, things we missed when we were out of town. We'll revisit them after this. Yesterday was the year anniversary of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, in which a woman was fatally struck by a car that was driven into the crowd. If you followed the hyperventilating press coverage leading up to yesterday's event, you probably expected to see thousands of hooded Klansmen showing up on horseback in D.C. to commemorate and celebrate the killing. White supremacy is just that prevalent in America, they tell us. It's everywhere. Except it's not. That's a lie. White supremacy is not ubiquitous in America. It's not a crisis. It's not even a meaningful category. It is incredibly rare. You could easily live your entire life in this country without meeting a single person who believes anything like that. Most of us have lived lives like that. I have. In fact, this is a generous, tolerant country. It always has been that. People who tell you otherwise are either delusional or trying to control you with fear, likely both. In the end yesterday, just a couple of dozen people showed up out of a country of 320 million people. They milled around for a while, got yelled at, and left. So much for the Klan rally. What is a crisis in America, and a growing crisis, is left-wing extremism and violence. Our elites abet and encourage it. Our media pretend it doesn't exist. Here, for example, was the scene yesterday in Washington. Antifa lunatics calling for the destruction of the United States of America. Watch. Benny Johnson of the Daily Caller took the time to interview some of the protesters. They freely confessed they would like to torture and kill the president.
What would you do if Donald Trump showed up at this rally? Murder him?
I mean, yo, he's America's Caesar, except he's a head. So, you gotta take him down.
Trump! If it came down to it and it was a group effort, we'd have to do him like Gaddafi.
If the president showed up at this march, what would you do, sir? Beat his
Meanwhile, in Charlottesville, protesters screamed at the cops. In D.C., they attacked police with bottles, fireworks, and eggs. Keep in mind, this is not the far right, it's the left. Cops on motorcycles were pushed as they tried to pass through the crowd. Back in Charlottesville, an NBC News reporter was assaulted by a screaming progressive. Watch this.
What's up? Don't worry about them now. Don't worry about me. Don't worry about them.
Amazingly, and it is amazing, NBC News didn't even bother to cover the assault on its own staff. The left did it, so it would have undermined their storyline. Screaming leftists in black face masks throwing bottles and calling for the destruction of America and the murder of the president. You know how CNN described this group? As, quote, anti-hate groups. Because their hate isn't really hate, it's the opposite of hate, even if it's exactly the same as hate. Pretty amusingly Orwellian, but also scary. Lying works over time, and that's exactly why they do it. Vox.com, in a rare fit of honesty, ran a piece entitled Antifa Clashes with Police and Journalists in Charlottesville and D.C. Well, that was too close to the truth for many on the left, and they complained. HuffPo, for example, did. Its hate and extremism reporter Christopher Mathias tweeted this, quote, "This is a bad article and is a good example of how not to cover white supremacy." A bad article. In other words, objective truth is bad when it obstructs the goal, which is gaining power. So lie or else, and most reporters do lie. But we don't have to lie. We can say what is obvious. The very people decrying fascism are the ones practicing fascism, crushing those who disagree with them, silencing contrary opinions, which they do constantly, threatening violence as they did yesterday. They can call it anti-hate all they want, but the truth is they would hurt you if they could. Mark Stein is an author and columnist. He guest hosted this program for 3 days last week and did a great job, and we're happy to have him back. So, Mark, you saw the video. Those, just so you know, those are anti-hate groups, the ones screaming and throwing things.
Yeah, and actually threatening to kill people and wearing masks and, in fact, having, as you said, having all the attributes, not of anti-fascists, but of fascists. And I'm one of those people, because when you look at them and you see like the little dweeby pajama boy types talking about wanting to kill people, and it's easy to laugh it off and say, they don't really mean it, they're not into it. But in fact, when you look at what has been going on, the increase in the level of targeted intimidation of people who just happen to have a political disagreement with them, I think we are approaching the point at which someone is going to get killed over this. And the media will play a large part in that, because when they say that thugs on the street intimidating not just political targets, but just general passing motor vehicle traffic, the media like CNN, who call them anti-hate groups, are actually a big part of the problem here. The sentimentalization and glamorization of violence.
Of course, but you can understand why the crowd is in a frenzy, because they believe what they've been told, which is there is a massive white supremacist fascist movement on the verge of taking over. And I guess my question is, where are these people? I've lived in this country for 49 years. I'm not familiar with any large group that believes that. I never run into anyone who thinks that. I don't know a single person who believes that. This is a fantasy. It's a lie. Why do the rest of us go along with it and be like, oh, yeah, it's a real problem? Really? Where? What are you talking about? I'm totally confused.
Well, you're wrong there, Tucker. There are 17 white supremacists in America. They're living in their parents' basement because nothing makes you feel more supremacist than living in your parents' basement. And somehow the media has presented this as a nationwide phenomenon. But it's important to understand why they've done that. They've done that as part of a strategy to delegitimize people, not people who are white supremacists, but people who are ever so teensy-weensily right of center. So it's part of their campaign to denormalize the Republican Party. And it's also, by the way, where restrictions on free speech lead. So when you have all this denormalization and deplatforming at American colleges, where you say, oh, we can't have this guy come and speak to us because he happens to believe that America should have tighter immigration controls, you eventually end up with people who are incapable of making any argument and can only punch you in the face. Because the alternative to free speech is just to blow things up and smash stuff, and that's what you see on the streets.
It does seem like we're all kind of complicit in this, though. I mean, I never hear anybody say, wait, I reject the premise of your argument. No. Everything you're saying is nuts. Nobody ever says that. Like, oh, yeah, well, it's too... No, it's like one side is absolutely bent on preventing me from saying what I think is true, and the other side's kind of passive. It's not parity. It's not even close, from what I can tell.
No, and I think that's where we don't push back on it hard enough. I mean, I think frankly, you know, it's a seduction. When you have comedians, for example, standing up waving the severed head of a president, that comedian doesn't want to actually sever the head of the president. That's a bit too much hard work for her. But you can see she's turned on by it. And there are other people who are turned on by it. And among all those people, maybe there is one who is sufficiently turned on by it. Not necessarily, because it's hard to get close to the president, but you may run into, you know, the assistant deputy undersecretary of whatever from the White House that you happen to have seen on TV when she's in an Applebee's or a 99s or whatever, and you might beat her up. I mean, that's actually, and Maxine Waters would encourage you to do that. So we have people who are essentially on the same continuum as the Charlie Hebdo killers, where they think the answer to those guys who killed the Charlie Hebdo, they were witty, amusing, intellectual people killed by guys who don't know anything except how to kick the door down and kill you. And that's actually, these guys in Antifa are the same thing. They can't make an argument. They're morons, but they're morons who have the scent of blood in their nostrils.
When you give up on speech, you wind up with violence. That is exactly right. That's a very deep point. Thank you. Mark Stein, we're going to see you again in just a minute. Because I was gone all the last week, I missed a ton of stories, including the creepy porn lawyer's future political plans. Amazingly, Mark is going to be back with a recap on all that happened. We'll be back in a minute. Plus, a new poll shows Democrats against free markets. One Democrat who agrees with socialism over capitalism joins us after the break. A new Gallup poll finds that Democrats are turning against free markets. 57% of Democrats have a favorable view of socialism compared to just 47% who view capitalism favorably. Ian Samuel is an associate professor at Indiana University, and he joins us tonight. Ian, thanks a lot for coming on.
Hey, great to be with you.
So I think our economic system is pretty skewed, and we're in a bad place. So I actually, unlike a lot of conservatives, understand why people are becoming skeptical of our version of capitalism. I am too. What I'm so struck by, though, is that Democrats aren't actually skeptical of capitalism. I never hear anybody on the left criticize Apple or Amazon or the private equity people or any of the people who are really making out more than anyone else in our society under our current economy. Why is that? They never criticize the system, ever.
I think you are confusing the Democratic Party with the left, right? So the Democratic Party, as presently constituted, is funded by capital, and their leaders will tell you that. But there is a vibrant movement on the left who are critical of capitalism as constituted in the United States and of the leadership of the Democratic Party. That is, in fact, the basis of their criticism. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, et cetera.
Really, it's interesting because I sort of know what you. I mean, you're half right, but I don't remember the last time I heard anybody in either wing of the Democratic Party criticize Jeff Bezos ever, or Tim Cook at Apple,
you should.
ever.
Listen to my friend Matt Stoller or Lena Khan. There are lots of people. I mean, Amazon's a good example because a lot of people on the left believe that Amazon is an example of a real monopoly problem, and that is actually an example of the way that markets have failed in the United States.
They're awfully quiet about it. So let me ask you this, though. So socialism, they've embraced socialism. Can you think of a place that it's worked? And don't give me some low population, totally homogenous Nordic country with a 1,000-year history of cooperation, okay? Because that's
a very elegant gerrymander. Can you give me an example of some place that it's worked?
Well, I don't know.
Other than the Northern European countries where it works beautifully.
Other than Nordic, look, I just spent the last week in a Nordic country. We have nothing in common with them. No, seriously, let's be real. Yeah.
I'll go along. I think it works well in the United States for the elderly, for example. The elderly in the United States live under a wonderful form of socialism. They have single-payer health care, they have a universal basic income in the form of Social Security, and they love it. So even in our heterogeneous country with its only 300-year history or so, socialism works quite well for the very old, and that's the exact reason that they're so politically engaged. They like it.
No, actually, you can't have socialism for part of the population. Socialism is a comprehensive system in which everybody participates, and the left is calling for a version of it now. So Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, among others, are now saying we need universal health care. And
that's exactly right.
And I understand Medicare for all. So
yeah.
Okay, but the cost, but hold on, the cost is not a small thing. So more than $32 trillion over a decade, doubling the entire federal budget. Don't just tell me that we're going to pay for it with savings. I mean, how exactly is that going to work in a country that's already incapable of paying its debts?
Well, so, Tucker, if you think Medicare for All is expensive, you should try the alternative. Not doing Medicare for All is going to cost $34 trillion. Now, those are two big numbers, but I think we both know which one is smaller. So, and don't forget, under Medicare for All, you actually get to cover everybody. Under the present system, you don't, right? And so, actually, you get a lot more for less money, and that's the art of the deal, my friend.
But wouldn't you need to close the borders immediately? Because if you offered this system where you get, quote, free health care, and you have open borders, which we obviously have, thanks to the left, how is that sustainable? Why wouldn't everyone in the hemisphere move to your country and partake of the free stuff? I mean, they would, correct? You can't have socialism and open borders at the same time, right?
Well, we certainly don't have any version of open borders right now. And if one believes that people who
we have 20 million people living here legally
actually generate value, which is actually a capitalist idea, then you should be comfortable with that, which is why there's actually a little bit of a tension in what you're saying. Like, the open borders advocates are capitalists. Like, the Koch brothers love
I'm very aware of that. The reason we have open borders is because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are basically being bought off. And in the case of the Democratic Party, there's the added benefit of new voters. But I'm just saying you can't have enormously generous social welfare programs and open borders. And the truth is, we do. Like, if you want to move here, you can. We can't deport you from the state of California, for example. So is that sustainable? I mean, could you add another 100 million people with low education levels, no skills, to a universal health care scheme? Really?
So our tradition in the United States, as you well know, has been, and people can attack this from both sides, but our tradition has been that immigrants to the United States, before they are citizens, actually don't get access to most social welfare programs, right? They pay taxes, they pay lots of taxes, but they don't actually get access to a lot of government programs. And so if you just maintained that status quo, I think there's actually not a funding challenge at all. Now, you could say on the left,
I'm not allowed to use,
should.
hold on, I'm not allowed to use the profanity on the air, so I'm not going to like spell out BS, but that's exactly what it is, what you just said. You telling me that there's a Democratic politician in America who would say, we're getting universal coverage, but non-citizens can't partake in it. There's not one who would say that. They would say, of course, we need to cover everybody.
That's essentially the way the Affordable Care Act works. And again, there are critics on both sides.
That's not true.
But it's not realistic to suggest there's not a way to navigate that. There clearly is.
Hold on.
And it's the status quo.
Do you think, a simple question, do you think there is any Democrat running for president who would look right into the camera and say, we need Medicare for all, but not non-citizens? There's not one.
Absolutely.
I bet you 1,000. Really, who? Who would say that?
Honestly, I think that Bernie Sanders got a lot of criticism because he has said, and remember, like border issues and immigration issues used to be a sort of left labor issue.
And then they had called him a racist, and I'm very aware of it. I just wrote a book on this, I know. But look, if he says that, I will give you $1,000. He's not brave enough to say that. Nobody on the left is brave enough to say that.
Well, don't give me $1,000. Give it to the campaign. I have $1,000. Give it to the campaign, Tucker.
That's not going to happen. Professor, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for.
Well, the latest edition of the New York Times editorial board is an open racist, also an immigrant to the United States, who grew up to despise white people for their skin color. How exactly did she get that way? We have an answer, and that's next. Well, brand new New York Times editorial board member Sarah Jeong has become an inspirational figure on the left, an unlikely one. Her example shows that despising people for their skin color is not only no barrier to career success, it helps as long as you despise the right group and then invent new definitions for words like racism to obscure what you're really saying. But Jeong and people like Jeong don't emerge organically. They are products of an education system here in America that trains people to think this way, and they're wrecking the country in so doing. Heather McDonald is a contributing editor at City Journal. She's followed this phenomenon very closely, and she joins us tonight. Heather, thank you for coming on. So how does this happen? So I mean, nobody, as they used to say when I was a child, nobody is born a bigot. It's something that you learn. We're creating a whole new generation of them. Why and how is this happening?
Well, there's a multi-million-dollar diversity bureaucracy on most college campuses today that is dedicated to the very propositions that Sarah Jeong embodies. Things like whiteness is a source of all evil in the world, lethal to people of color, a contempt for objectivity and truth-seeking, a belief that all females exist in a state of oppression by rape culture. This diversity bureaucracy hits students with this ideology from the moment they step foot on campus, putting them in the throes of a very terrible delusion. American college students are the most privileged human beings in history simply by virtue of their access to vast educational opportunities, and yet college presidents on down tell them that they are the subject of ubiquitous racism on the college campus itself.
So why, I mean, it's clearly just literally destroying the country and a generation of promising young people, and yet the rest of us who are not young are subsidizing it, either directly through tuition or donation or indirectly through our taxes. Why are we all playing along with this?
I think people still don't get what's going on. I would hope that with knowledge would come power and action. People basically send their kids off to school and have trust that these are the colleges that they remember from growing up. They are not. They are hatred machines. As you say, Tucker, there is a conveyor belt from the academy into the world at large, into corporations, into the media. As you say also, Sarah Jeong was treated with a big yawn by the mainstream media and by liberal institutions because her ideology is banal. It is simply the state of the art right now, whether it's the New York Times, CNN, or the Washington Post. People have to stop giving money to colleges. Don't give it to your alma mater unless you've done very thorough due diligence inquiry. And they need to start standing up for this lie that America is a fundamentally bigoted place, because we are toying with real civil war, I think, at this point.
Exactly, and we're funding it, and we should stop because it's cancer. Heather, thank you for so crisply articulating all that. I appreciate it.
Great to see you, Tucker.
We're about to talk to a man who says he was banned by Twitter for arguing against the beliefs of the left. That was his crime, articulating an alternative view. It wasn't hatred, but it was totally unacceptable to the corporate gatekeepers of speech. He joins us next. As we've told you in some detail in this program, Google, the company, the most powerful company in the history of the world, collects a staggering amount of information from everybody who uses Android mobile phones or any of their apps. Google says you can stop them from collecting this information, but we have new information suggesting that that's not true. Brett Larson is an anchor of Fox News Headlines 24/7. He has a follow-up on our exclusive investigation. Brett?
Hey, Tucker. As you recall, back in February, we drove around our nation's capital with 2 Android phones and found that even without a data network connection and in airplane mode, the 2 devices tracked our every move. And now, a new report from the Associated Press confirms it's even worse. Even when you turn off location tracking, as Google told us could be done, it may still be tracking you. It's a bit of a don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain here. You can turn off or even pause location history, but using other Google apps like Search or checking the weather on your Android phone will pinpoint your location based on your latitude and longitude, which is accurate to about a square foot. Now, that data point is then saved to your Google account. There are some 2 billion devices that run Google's Android operating system and hundreds of millions of iPhone users that also make use of Google for maps, search, and even photos. Now, Google says they're being upfront with users. If you want to shut off this other location data collection, you have to go into the Web and App Activity settings and disable it there. If you simply turn off location history, it still stores your location data. It just doesn't place it on your timeline for you to see and delete. Confused? That may be the point. Google uses this location data to sell advertising, and the more precise they can be with your location and the more they know about you, the better the ads. And Google can even show advertisers when foot traffic increased from an ad, because they'll see you went into the store. Google's ad revenue rose 20% in 2017 to $95.4 billion. So once again, it is a case of you not being a customer when using these free services. You are the product, and your privacy is what is for sale. Tucker?
Just don't be evil, Brett.
I just don't be evil and turn your phone off.
Don't be evil. It sounds bitter even to hear it. Now, thanks a lot for that report, Brett Larson.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
Appreciate it. Twitter, one of the few remaining tech companies, maybe the only, that hasn't purged Alex Jones in the last week. That doesn't mean that freedom of speech is safe on the platform. Far from it. Peter Van Buren, for example, is a former State Department employee and author. He says he was banned from Twitter for life for having a political debate on their platform. Peter Van Buren joins us tonight to explain what exactly happened. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
As honestly as you can, tell us why you were banned from Twitter.
There was a discussion going on among journalists about whether they had any culpability in bringing America to war. This followed the president's statement that some of the journalists are enemies of the people. And I joined in and explained that while I was a State Department official in Iraq, I often lied to journalists on behalf of the government, that I misled them, and this was part of my job, and I eventually blew the whistle on myself and on the State Department and came clean on this. Many of the journalists overreacted, or reacted, I should say, to that and claimed that they were not responsible for fussing out these lies, that in fact it was my fault for not being truthful to them. I replied that it was their responsibility as journalists to hold the government to account, to be more skeptical of government, and Twitter being Twitter, it kind of went downhill from there.
Well, let me just note that virtually the entire Washington establishment and especially journalists, are reflexively pro-war in the creepiest possible way. So I think you're absolutely right on that, I having seen it for 30 years. But where was the point where you crossed the line in Twitter's view that you got banned for life?
Well, that's the interesting part, is that I don't really know. Over the course of 7 years on Twitter, I've sent out over 29,000 tweets, and I don't know which one actually crossed the line because Twitter has not responded, and Twitter doesn't tell you why you are banned. I simply received an automated response saying that something I had written incited people to silence through fear. One of my tweets that was reported, it was an attempt at a bad joke. It's maybe not the most proud piece of writing I've done. I was watching Fear the Walking Dead while I was tweeting, and I wrote something about maybe someone will come eat your face. That apparently consists of violence the same way, I guess, that when you tell someone to go jump in a lake, that consists of an invitation to go swimming.
You don't seem threatening to me. Very quickly, do you think if you'd been advocating for war with Iran, like Bill Kristol and everybody else in Washington, that you would have been banned?
Oh, absolutely. Advocating for war is perfectly acceptable within Twitter's boundaries. The two people who were banned alongside of me, one president of the Ron Paul Institute and another person who runs antiwar.com, were both banned for supporting me. Look, the main thing is not for me to be here talking about what I tweeted. The main thing would be if people could actually read those tweets and decide for themselves whether I was worth following. I've been stopped from tweeting twice in the last 6 months. Once when I visited Iran, and the government of Iran blocked Twitter for everyone. And once here in the United States, where Twitter blocked me.
But you'll notice that the neocon warmongers never get banned, ever.
Never.
Peter, thank you very much. Never,
thank you very much.
Irony of irony.